Hi, this is Ken Jarecke, and today we're talking pictures with Paul Bellinger. We're Paul's going to ask me a few questions about a recent video I did on my workflow, toning and making pictures ready to share on social media. So that's what we're talking about. Hey, Paul.
How's it going?
Going well.
Good. I'm excited to talk about this one. We're gonna be talking about Alex, the photojournalist. I think it's episode number 8.
Oh, we're talking about Alex now instead of Tony.
Yeah.
Okay,
S-
sounds
You just
good.
got it. You got it reversed. We'll change our outfits and come back and talk about toning afterwards.
Sounds good.
So first, I wanted to say I really enjoyed this episode with Alex. I really liked his candor, and I think he's a fantastic photographer. And I remember it was probably sometime back in April, March, maybe even February. I was at your house, and we were talking about political photography and stuff. And you pulled up his Instagram account and showed me and said, "This is one of the people out there that's doing it today. That you actually enjoy." Looking forward to seeing his pictures in your feed you actually enjoy looking at. And I just wanted to, from the beginning, just kind of ask, how did you find Alex? And how did you make that relationship with him?
I think well the way I first heard his name, Stephen Crowley from formerly of the New York Times told me about him. That's how I first heard of Alex. But then I started following him on Instagram, and I kind of realized I knew his work a little bit already.
Nice. And so what's his lineage then in terms of, is Stephen Crowley his mentor?
Yeah, I'd say Steve was his mentor. Um, he's taken influences obviously from more than just Steve. He he's a little bit self-taught, or at least that's what his passion has led him into this business, which most of the good ones, that's how they get into this business. They feel they figure out they can't really do anything else, and so that's how they start getting into this. And one of the reasons they get into it in the first place is because they like to look at pictures. So when you're looking at pictures, you find people that you appreciate their work. You start following those. Those become your influencers right off the before you kind of know that you're learning from them. You just kind of like looking at their pictures. And I think that's probably what happened with Alex.
So who is Stephen Crowley then? I mean, I know he mentioned that Alex did an internship at the New York Times. I'm guessing that's where Stephen sort of took him under his wing. So tell us about who he is and what his relationship is with political photography.
Steve is, well, he just retired from the New York Times. I guess we'll have to have him on the show now. He was, he was there. Well, Steve, take him out of, don't just limit him to the New York Times. He was kind of the guy in Washington D.C. who was making pictures that were thoughtful, that had insight, that were beyond just documenting the latest press conference. He was the guy who brought a little bit of cleverness, a little bit of insight, a little bit of knowledge into how Washington works. He brought that all into his images.
So, I mean, it's safe to say that he's a legendary political photographer. He's mostly known for his work in politics.
Yeah, I mean, he's completely known for his work in politics. He's legendary in the fact that the New York Times uh, have had a couple of people. George Thames is one who comes to mind, who because their work was so good, and everybody saw it in Washington D.C. because everybody reads the New York Times. They became they got more access because of that. They they had more. Their images took on, you know, they were powerful. They make powerful images of historical events, but since they had such a visible platform in the New York Times, they're, yeah, you could say they've hit that legendary button, achievement unlocked.
So, I mean, we've talked a little bit in the past about like the gatekeepers and stuff on Capitol Hill. And would you say that Stephen Crowley kind of represents the kind of guy that was able to navigate that whole landscape just like flawlessly and be able to, I mean, he knows, like, if you were going to be going to Washington next week to go shoot something, would you call him first and talk to about, who do you need to talk to get a credential and things like this?
Well, he's the guy that you talk to. If you're working on Capitol Hill, you'd be wise just to follow him around, and people do that kind of stuff. He knows Capitol Hill better than anybody up there working, to my knowledge. So on the campaign trail, we spent a lot of time together on various campaigns, and we're two kind of different photographers. He's a true news photographer, but he brings insight into uh, how he photographs that news situation.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. He's someone that we need to go in depth on a little bit in the future. We need to get him on the podcast and everything. We can go more into that later. So getting into the conversation with Alex, it's about political photography. It's about shooting campaigns and things like that. And I'm wondering, just what's your opinion on the current state of political photography? Alex mentioned that it's more competitive than ever. He said that he's talked to guys that have been, doing it. This is like their fourth or fifth time going to Iowa. He said it's more competitive than ever. We know that there's less outlets than ever. So according to that logic, extreme amount of competition, very few outlets. It would seem that the pictures that would be getting published in magazines and in newspapers and stuff would probably be better than ever. That's sort of what logic would dictate. You got all these people shooting it, and there's few outlets, so the magazines have the pick of the best of the best. Is that your opinion on the state of it? Is it better than ever?
No, I think it's I think personally, I think it's at a low point, because there's no. Alex is an exception to the rule because there's not a whole lot of upside to people following the various campaigns. I didn't want to really get into it with Alex. Every 4 years, at least one photographer would emerge out of the presidential campaign, and that photographer would go on to have, a career in Washington D.C. They'd get a contract with a magazine, or they'd get a staff job at a newspaper, something like that. They'd make a name for themselves coming out of the campaign. I don't know what you get as a photographer coming out of this campaign. Everybody's in Iowa right now, and then they'll go to New Hampshire, and after that, it's going to be very difficult for two reasons. One, going up to Super Tuesday, I guess you still have South Carolina in there, but after that, things get so spread out that you really need to pick a candidate and get on their press plane. Well, the problem is now that most of these campaigns won't have a press plane, so you can't. And so you can only get on a press plane. Getting on the press plane was expensive. It cost you a couple $1,000s a day just to be on that charter flight, not to mention hotels and meals and all that kind of stuff. So you kind of needed some type of real gig to get past New Hampshire into Super Tuesday. You needed some support. Well, now not only do the magazines and the newspapers don't really make that investment, the campaigns themselves don't. I don't think they'll have an official press plane until probably the conventions, whenever those happen in August, I suppose. So it's a different landscape. They're bouncing around. The primaries are really a national campaign at this point. Certainly after you get out of New Hampshire, they're a full-blown national campaign. So I don't know how you do that, because really the magazines are just the newspapers. There's no way to travel really with the campaigns unless they have a press plane, and they're not going to make, you know, that investment. So they're going to have different photographers planted around the country, from what I can tell. I'm kind of guessing, but I just don't. It's a national campaign with no uh, national way for a singular voice to photograph it, from what I can see.
So you're saying that sort of like out of this laboratory, you're not going to get great. It's not really conducive to having great photographers emerge out of that sort of environment.
Well, I don't want to say that. I don't want to discourage anybody. You know, these photographers are spending. They're making the investment. They're making the commitment. Uh, the first the first campaign that I kind of remember was in I want to say it was 76. 76 was it, or 80? I don't remember. Obviously, I don't remember 76. So it had to be 80. There was a photographer, Cynthia Johnson, who she did the same thing that these younger photographers are doing today. She had a van, and she worked in Iowa, and then she drove to New Hampshire, and she got an in with the Bush senior campaign. And so when Bush became Reagan's vice president, his personal photographer became Cynthia Johnson. And then Cynthia, you know, parlayed that job into a contract with Time magazine. So that was in 1980. 1984, I'm sure there was somebody else in that uh, position that that worked hard in Iowa and New Hampshire, and then became a name in Washington D.C., or at least somebody that would get regular work in Washington D.C. If you flash forward to the David Burnett interview, you know, he mentions how one of his first post at Time magazine was in Washington D.C., and I'd forgotten that. And his, you know, he'd get so many jobs a week, 4 or 5 jobs a week, working on a day rate in Washington D.C. Nobody really gets 4 or 5 days in Washington D.C. these days. If they do, they're kind of doing a stakeout, you know, in front of the federal courthouse, or they're doing something that maybe a staff photographer, or maybe the photographer who really has a good in at the Washington Post or the New York Times, they're getting secondary jobs that person isn't available to do. So it's really tough. It's really tough. Uh, you know, some of the magazines, some of the newspapers have promised these freelance photographers jobs on a regular basis if they relocated to Washington, D.C. And as soon as they do relocate to Washington, D.C., it's like they lose their phone numbers once they get them in town. So there's a lot of downward pressure on the marketplace. And the magazines and the newspapers aren't really doing anything to relieve that pressure.
Okay, so I mean, it sounds like, you know, what you're basically arguing is that it's not a great environment for it's a difficult environment for photographers to persist and emerge and hone their craft and become great photographers.
Well, yeah, because it's hard to become a great, you can get to a certain point as the good photographer with a ton of potential, but it's like, you know, people usually just don't go into the major leagues. They spend time in the minor leagues, and when they're in the minor leagues, they're getting paid to play baseball. They're getting paid to produce. They're learning the ins and outs, you know, that get them into the major league, the show. And even when they're in the major league, they still get a chance to develop and hone their skills, but they're getting supported the whole way. And I don't see that happening right now in photojournalism.
Yeah, and I mean, Alex mentioned it throughout, just the difficulty, the lack of jobs, the lack of work, the need to take up as a freelancer, the need to take up uh, alternative jobs, commercial jobs, and things like that. But on the flip side, so we kind of established like it's a difficult situation for great photographers to emerge. Are you seeing in on the print side of things that the pictures that are being published are not very good? I mean, it seems like the magazines and the few outlets that are out there, you know, would have be able to choose from the cream of the crop. They'd have only the best photographers working for them, and they would have they would have the access to the best pictures.
Well, I don't see the New York Times every day. I don't see the Washington Post every day. Um, Time Magazine, I don't know what Time Magazine is right now. Whatever it is, anybody who worked for Time Magazine when it was still Time Magazine wouldn't say it's Time Magazine. People, editors that I worked with at Time Magazine don't even look at it today. I will pick it up if I happen to be in Barnes and Noble, and I'll pick it up and go through it. And I'm not, I'm not trying to be mean, but I don't see anything that has uh, a lasting quality to it. And a lot of that stuff that Time Magazine is publishing on a weekly basis, they pick up from freelancers who originally shot it for the New York Times or the Washington Post or uh, Getty or something like this. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's no brass ring to reach for. It just doesn't exist. They've taken the brass ring away. They've removed it. So now they want you to, buy your tickets for the ride, but there's no, I just don't see any, I don't see any payoff. And so, and like I said, I don't want to discourage people, but it has to change. It has to change to get back to that level of, that pushes people to get to that next level of greatness. And I don't think you can do that. You know, there's two ways to do it. Either you're really hungry and you're really striving to reach a goal and there's a concrete reward at the end of that goal, or you're independently wealthy and you don't, you're a Cartier-Bresson and you're shooting pictures as, you don't have to really worry about your pictures selling or how you're going to get from A to Z. So, it's either the independently wealthy advanced amateur or the publishing industry's dropped the other side of the equation. So I don't know what that is.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of just like pure hustle, that someone has to be out there like Alex, that's you know, uh renting Airbnbs with his buddies and splitting rooms and driving on their own dime. I mean, I think you even mentioned to me once that, your first time you went and shot the campaigns in Iowa, you were doing the same kind of thing. Like you were just kind of sleeping in your car. You didn't have any guarantees. You didn't have any, and you know, no, I mean, you didn't know where it was going to go necessarily. And in the end of it, you became, pretty important political photographer. Over time, you persisted. So, I mean, definitely there's
Okay,
still
so
a way,
here's the
but
difference.
it's just
Here's,
harder.
so that was in '87. Uh, I mean, the first campaign stuff I did was in '83, '84, and I was really young, and I just took whatever I was shooting for, like the AP. I didn't really know what I was doing. The second time it came around, and it started in '87, '88, there were 7 or 8 Democrat candidates, and they uh, they were spending a lot of time in Iowa, and I was I had my parents in Omaha. I had friends in Iowa, so I could sleep on their couches. I could drive from Omaha if I had to, and I would just photograph whatever I could. Well, the difference is I had an agency, and the agency was, getting my work and marketing my work. So I was getting a little bit of money coming in. I wasn't doing much assignment work, but the thing that the difference is that, so there were 7 or 8, they called them like the 7 dwarves, the Democrat candidates, I think, that year, but I think there were 8 of them, but whatever. They, Life magazine did an essay on these Democrat candidates, and it was all pickup material. And out of the 7 or 8 candidates, I had 4 or 5 of the, pictures of 4. So I had the majority of the ink from these candidates in Life magazine through my agency on work that I'd shot over the last 6 months, maybe. So there was a payoff there, getting 4 or 5 images when there are like 7 or 8 images available spots in Life magazine. That's a calling card. That's a big win. And so then I could get assignment work after that issue came out. And Life, I mean, I got jobs from the New York Times. I started traveling with Bob Dole. I traveled with Jesse Jackson. Then I got a contract with Life magazine to follow Jesse Jackson for 6 months. Those are real payoffs that allowed me, I had a contract with Life magazine that I could do anything I wanted with Jesse Jackson as long as I didn't go over 7 days a month. So I would pick when I would travel. I'd pick, what I would shoot, basically. So, and then after that, after Jesse, got out of the race in Atlanta, then I went up to the Bush campaign also for Life magazine. And then there was, Dukakis in there for Time and U.S. News and World Report and just everybody, Fortune magazine. There were all these jobs out there, but by working on my own for 5 or 6 months and making a big score in Life magazine, on the pages of Life magazine, all that became open to me.
Okay, exactly. And so what you're saying is that today, let's say you go out and you do that and you get a couple pictures in Time magazine, or even 5 pictures in Time magazine. That's kind of the end of it. It's like, what's really the benefit of getting published in Time magazine? Is that going to lead to more contracts, more assignments? You're certainly not going to get 6 months, a 6-month assignment to go trail a candidate around.
Well, no, I mean, people don't even look at Time magazine. This abomination that has Life magazine, on the newsstands and the end caps in Walmart, their latest issue is cats. So, yeah, I mean, it doesn't exist. I don't know what the pay. I mean, there's foreign publications. That's the other thing. When we talk, I'm just talking about U.S. publications, but we got a lot of ink all over Europe and Japan, and so I don't know how that happens anymore. It's kind of gone. So while what I'm saying is, I don't want to, I don't want to discourage anybody, and I want to encourage them. And I think a lot of, people like Alex are doing great work. I just don't know what the end game is.
Exactly. All right. Well, you mentioned something there that kind of goes along with something that you said during Alex. You talked about how, Life magazine has some pictures of cats. It's like a cat issue or something. You mentioned with talking with Alex that what we have today is kind of a slurpy media, that it's like, kind of a sugar high. It's a low hanging fruit. It's the easiest thing to consume, but it has no nutritional content whatsoever. And I would just wonder, do you think that this is sort of a thing that comes from Instagram and people just wanting to, like, look at pictures, they consume pictures just by scrolling past? And I mean, this certainly isn't something that is only affecting political photography.
Well, I see, that's the thing. You could, whatever I said about Time magazine and it being, not a factor anymore, You could quadruple that for Sports Illustrated. What an ESPN, the magazine, just shuttered their doors, 4 or 5 months ago. So
Uh,
what's the end game if you're a sports photographer? There's 100 blogs out there, and they're each using original content, and they're each pulling, different sports images from whatever team they're dedicated to into their blog. But usually they're pulling these at some type of subscription basis, and the photographers don't see any benefit from that. They get a flat rate. They sign contracts that basically turn over their copyright to these sports agencies, which aren't agencies. They're not helping the photographer at all make a living. They're paying them a very low day rate, and the sports blogs can all use the content on some type of subscription basis for very cheap. Uh, there is no, I mean, I was emailing Neil Leifer today, and we were talking about some other issue, and it's just, this is a guy who started shooting for Sports Illustrated, getting paid to shoot for Sports Illustrated when he was 15 years old. Um, what would Neil Leifer do? What would the 15-year-old Neil Leifer do today? I don't know. I don't know
yeah,
that there's an answer to that question right now.
yeah, yeah. What would the 15-year-old Ken Jarecke do? Like you said, if you don't come from a family with a lot of means, your average everyday person isn't going to be able to be a photographer. You're going to have to self-fund in some way. Or I do think what Alex mentioned is, you cannot make a living strictly off of editorial assignments. So you're going to have to take commercial jobs, and you have to take do other work on the side.
Yeah, I mean, you can, but said to Alex, I mean, if you're writing articles for the New Yorker, Time Magazine, the Atlantic, uh, would you feel comfortable as a writer writing ad copy for Procter and Gamble for ads that were going to appear in those same magazines? To me, that's, it's a conflict. It's always been a. I'm just. I'm not an advertising photographer. I'm a photojournalist, and I
Yeah.
shouldn't have to subsidize this by selling aspirin.
Yeah, exactly. You're a PFJ. I mean, how are you supposed to be good at photojournalism when, you have to worry about hair and makeup for some corporate shoot that you have to do coming up on the weekend? I mean, you're supposed to be covering the most important things that are happening in the world, and you have to have other things on your mind, like, oh, I got to book a model for a corporate shoot this weekend. I got to book a hair and makeup artist, or I need to, what kind of backgrounds am I going to use for this, car shoot or whatever it may be that you have to do to just pay the bills.
The ironic thing about that is the ad agencies, the one that are hiring photographers, won't hire photojournalists, um, because they don't believe the photojournalist has the skills of the commercial photographer. Um, they'll hire a commercial photographer to shoot pictures of a kid in a classroom somewhere, where the photojournalist does that, every other week, and does it without hair and makeup and craft services and all that kind of stuff, and they do it really well. So this is the thing. You either have to go all in being a commercial photographer and separating yourself from the photojournalism world to convince the ad agencies that, oh, you really can set up a picture. You really can take art direction, whatever their issues are. And they have all kinds of issues, when the photojournalist is actually the best person for making pictures in a timely, deadline, without a whole lot of manipulation or help from other people. And this is what they do. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, if you want to hire a great photographer, you hire a photojournalist um, who has a great eye, and or you can be a commercial photographer and you can spend tens of thousands of dollars a year in marketing and getting the right color palette for your website and the right paper stock for your self promotions and the email list of all the in art directors that you have to. I mean, you can do all that. That's a full
Yeah.
time job that's going to cost you whatever. Say it costs you 2 months of time and $50,000 a year to do that, just to market yourself as a commercial photographer, and then hopefully you get 3 or 4 commercial jobs that year that earn you back $250,000. I don't that doesn't have a whole lot to do with photography. At the end of the day, that's really has nothing to do with anything as far as photography is concerned. It has to do with marketing. It has to do with public relations. It has to do with going to the right parties and schmoozing the right people. It's not photography.
Yeah, that's true. So much goes into doing photography as a business, not as a photojournalist, not as a journalist, but as a business. I mean, you really have to wear a ton of different hats. I mean, when you were coming up, like you said, you had an agency, Contact Press. I mean, you don't have to worry about websites. You don't have to worry about fonts and marketing your business cards, paper stocks, and walking around with portfolios and things like this. And that's what enabled you to become an amazing journalist, which has inherent uh, value in a democracy of informing the public. There's not an inherent value in commercial photography. There's a monetary value to doing it, and I certainly think, like, if you're gonna have to do that on the side, that's a full-time job by itself. And then, so let's say you go through all those steps, you jump through all those hoops, you got the website, the networking, the email, you're sending out samples, you start booking these big time commercial jobs. Maybe you can get a $20,000 job that takes a weekend. How What are you going to do when Time Magazine comes calling and offering you $250 a day to go to some dangerous place and photograph, out in the heat and out in the elements, and for 250 bucks per day, I mean, you could do one job, like one commercial job that will, net you a lot more money than that and not have to work nearly as hard. I mean, like you said, you have to work on all the other stuff. So, I mean, the incentive, I mean, I face this all the time where, I mean, I would love to do more photojournalism. I would love to go work for some editorial for some magazines and things like this, but I can make so much more money with barely lifting a finger in my studio doing headshots. It's just not really worth my time. People ask me to do shoots for magazines and stuff, and they tell me the day rate, and it's just like, sorry, I mean, I'm not leaving my studio for less than my day rate, my day rate, not their day rate. So, I mean, what incentive do I have to then become a good photojournalist? I mean, I really think it is pushing photographers into doing other things, and this really important thing that we have in a democracy of a free press and informed public and pictures that really mean something and make a difference. They're going to be falling by the wayside. They're going to be left up to people with trust funds, or maybe they're going to be left up to people who are willing to just be broke in order to do it, that they love it that much.
Well, every photojournalist I know has always been broke and continues to be broke. Even when they were paying us a lot of money, we were broke. Even when we were getting ink in one story in 20 different countries, we were still broke. That's not these. I don't know if it's a chicken or an egg situation, but photojournalists don't handle their money well, and the only thing they're really concerned about is getting on the plane and getting to that next story, telling that next story. And so then you combine that with this idea. Okay, so you're going to whatever, you're going to a war somewhere. All of a sudden, um, the paying the plumber to come to your house to fix your sink isn't the top priority. The Amex bill isn't the top priority. Your top priority is to get into the country, to get onto a transport that will take you to where you need to be, to get and find a place to stand and to survive, and then get your pictures out. So everything else to that is secondary. There's no marketing, there's no commercialness to it. It's just about making the best pictures you can. And so when you distill it down to that, and everything else kind of just kind of crumbles in comparison. So that's why photojournalists aren't great at managing those other things, because they're so far down the list of priorities.
Mhm. As they should be. I mean, because I do think that photojournalism is just one of those things that has, it has to be taken seriously. It's so important in a democracy, especially that, we need people that are purely dedicated to that aren't distracted by, websites and social media and a bunch of other stuff. We need them to be focused, like you said, how to get in and what they're going to do when they get there.
Well, think about what a photojournalist is doing. For the most part, they're trying to tell a story in not necessarily real time, but say a long-term story is a month, 6 weeks, whatever. They have 6 weeks to tell a story. They don't have motion, they don't have sound, they just have still images. That's kind of a ridiculous thing to ask somebody to do. So photojournalism, and I've said it before, it is an art form. It's a practical craft, but it's also an art form. And the people working at that high level that can capture and tell stories that engage and move people, they're not really a whole lot of good for doing other kinds of stuff. They're just not. It's just everything has to be. You wouldn't ask um, a composer to shoot his own music video. It's just
Yeah.
two different skill sets.
Yeah, no, I love like those Danny DeVito commercials. Or like, you wouldn't ask like a gym trainer to do your taxes for you. Um, so yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, I think that the photojournalists that are really good, I mean, they gotta really want it, and they gotta really go all in on it. And so I think for a lot of people that want to have families and that want to have a standard of living and that sort of thing, it's kind of off limits,
That's not.
because there really is no way. It's very difficult to support a family. You could not really support a family as a photojournalist today.
Well, then that's the next issue. So, um, say you're working as a young photographer and you're making a couple $100 a day. You're making a whatever. Say you're clearing $1,000 a week. You're making like $4,000 a month, and you're 25 years old. You're okay at this point.
Yeah.
Um, but then you want to have a family, and you want to move into a slightly better neighborhood. All of a sudden, that $4,000 a month isn't covering the bills. And what's going to happen when you're working for whoever? Some, you're stringing for some wire agency. They're going to say, sorry, it was great while it lasted. We've got 5 other kids who would love to be in your position. So you're in the 28. You've gone. Your career cycle is 3 or 4 years, and it's over. And the only way you can stay in the business, the only way you can pay your bills, is to become a photo editor. So right when you've been working on a daily basis as a photojournalist for 4 or 5 years, and right when you're starting to make that leap where you're either going to just phone it in each day, which a lot of people do, or you're going to jump to that next level, right when you get to that point, um, the the only way you can stay in the business is to put your camera down. There's no,
Yeah. And
it's a no
and
win.
even then, I think Yeah, and even then, I think photo editor jobs are far and few between as well. So there's a lot less of those than there are even jobs for photojournalists.
No, not really, because the New York Times has they're hiring photo editors all the time now, because what they don't need photographers working. They don't need relationships with photographers they can trust, who they know what makes them tick, and they can work together hand in hand to produce a better product for their readers. They need photo editors to just comb through content coming in from social media accounts, from the different agencies, from a dozen different freelance photographers spread out across the country, who are all shooting candidate A as they go from town to town. And as soon as they come into their zone, then the photographer in Atlanta jumps into action. So they might be managing 12 photographers across the country when they'd be managing one who was traveling with a campaign uh, in the past. So people like the New York Times, publications like the New York Times, they're expanding their photo editors uh, jobs. They're not hiring any new staff photographers. Um, Rarely. I mean, they took a year after Steve Crowley retired. They took a year to fill that position in Washington D.C. So they had one photographer, Doug Mills, and covering Washington D.C., and the rest was done by freelance photographers. The New York Times had an intern shoot Obama's first presidential campaign.
Wow.
What kind of publication would send an intern as a writer to cover a national political campaign? So no, they
Wow.
have plenty of photo editors. You just don't have any committed relationships or with staff
Yeah,
photographers.
and that's kind of a different role that the photo editors play than the ones that like a Karen Malarkey type figure.
No, they're not. They're not. It's not.
They're kind of
They're
like
more like,
content filters.
yeah. They're they're more like photographer wranglers, not photographer coaches.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. They're kind of in cahoots with the corporate side of whatever publication that they're working with, trying to get the most out of photographers without paying them anything. Um, so, okay, let's move on from talking about that. I wanted to get overall your take on shooting politics. Just kind of walk us through your approach, and we can talk afterwards. How shooting politics is different from other things. You mentioned some of it in Alex's podcast about how you're kind of a no holds barred kind of guy. So let's give us your take
Well,
overall.
okay,
Walk us
so
through what you're thinking.
like I've said, in the plenty of times, that when I first started shooting politics, I didn't really know what was happening, or what the game was about. Quickly, I figured that out. I was time and time again, you'd have somebody say, "Oh, we really want you to stand over here instead of over here," and you started noticing that. I mean, that everything was designed to manipulate you as a photographer. I was Bush 41's national presidential campaign. He won the presidency in '88. I was traveling with him, and this guy came up to me, and I didn't know who he was, and it was before an event. He's like, "What do you think about the lighting up here?" And I'm like, "Yeah, it's okay, but really, there's a banner over there which is just hiding in the shadows, and if I'm shooting from this direction, that banner is just going to be a black shadow." And I didn't know who he was. I thought I was just talking, photography. And Artie Grace, a great political photographer, Newsweek, based in Washington D.C., knows the ins and outs of everything happening there. He pulls me aside. He's like, "Why are you talking to that guy? You don't talk to that guy. That's the guy." This was the guy who crafted Ronald Reagan's visual presence. And so then now he's working for George Bush, and he's, pumping you for information so he can craft your photography for you. And sure enough, the very next event, uh, there was light on that. It was a different venue, 1,000 miles away, but sure enough, there was light on that banner hanging on the right-hand side. So, um, everything is designed, like I said to Alex, they're going to spend on an event, they're going to spend $50,000 on lights alone. They're going to spend, $5,000 on confetti and balloons. They're going to, everything about that is designed to manipulate. It's basically, they're setting up a stage. It's a commercial shoot that is designed to attract a photographer as flies to honey. They and if you're not experienced, you don't even get what's happening to you. So as soon as I started realizing that, everybody, and you're friends with people, you're hanging out with people 20 hours a day on a political campaign, you become friends with people, but their job is to manipulate you. They're sending their message, and you're just the medium. You're just the pigeon to carry that message for them. So as soon as you realize that, you kind of take the gloves off, and you're just like, it's kind of the only way to not fall into their trap is to kind of just make pictures that are pictures in themselves and are interesting or ironic or counter to whatever they're trying to say. That's the only thing you can do as a photographer. You have to you have to, whatever jujitsu, you have to use their energy against them.
So, along those lines, like give us like a little bit more of an example of what exactly you would do, how you reacted against that in your own personal experience. Because I know, like, you as a person, you're into punk rock and you're a rebel without a cause and all this. So I could just imagine someone trying to tell, Ken Jarecki where to stand. That would be met with the ultimate reaction. So what in practice would you do to get around these kind of things?
Well, so like you said, my natural impulse was to fight against it from the start. So even before I had that concrete example, that just kind of brought it all home, I was naturally fighting against this stuff anyways. And so if they didn't want me to stand someplace, then I'd, make a point of standing there. Or, everything was satire, everything was just like, look at this circus, look at this completely manufactured event. That was from the start, and that wasn't anything I had to like verbally think about late at night. Oh, I'm going to go out and use their images against them. No, that's just something I was doing anyways. So it was just my natural inclination. So, and then
Yeah, you told me once about a story of two women politicians. I don't know if it was in Omaha or Council Bluffs, and they would refuse to stand next to each other. Tell me that story again, if you can recall off the top of your head.
well, that was like my first job. It was my first job for Time magazine. It was for Marianne Golan. She was in charge of the people section of the magazine, which was like a one page, and it'd have like 8 stories on one page with little postage stamps worth of photos. And it would just be like people in the news, I think was the actual name of the section. And so there was a gubernatorial race in Nebraska, and both the candidates were women, and that's something that hadn't happened before. So my job was to photograph the two of them together. And so they had an event at the state fair. It was a debate, and afterwards I had to get a picture of them, like a formal portrait of the two of them standing together. And one of the candidates was a little older and she didn't want to be photographed next to the younger candidate, and she just put up a fuss. And and I basically said, it's up to you. I'm here for Time Magazine. If you don't want your picture in Time Magazine, then that's up to you. But the only way it's going to go in the magazine is if the two of you are together. And it pissed her off. And she, her campaign, I don't know if she actually called, and I mean, it wasn't, I don't know if she called Marianne or if she called an editor. I don't know who she called, but she made a big fuss. And it could have been my last job for Time Magazine, but Marianne was like, this is exactly what you do. You don't let them dictate to us how they're going to appear in the magazine. And
Wow, that's so awesome that she was like a shield for you and actually went, had your back and went to bat for you. Because certainly there's been times in my career where if I'm someplace and I'm representing a magazine, I get the opposite sort of treatment. It's sort of like, don't embarrass us, don't do anything that will ruffle anyone's feathers, or else, we're going to get kicked out of here and you're going to lose your access and we're never going to call you again. So I mean, that's just an awesome story for that reason alone. But also this whole idea of these campaigns trying to control and manipulate you and everything like that. So tell me the story about who was the politician you were on the road with them for a long time. I want to say it might have been Howard Dean, and who it was sort of one of these moments that was maybe it wasn't Howard Dean, but it was a moment where their father had passed, or there was a death, or there was a funeral or something like that, and you went right up and you were shooting them right in their face and taking pictures of them after they were having an emotional reaction to something. I don't remember the exact details of the story. And you were right in their face, and um, just if you can recall that story, I think you mentioned it to me that you ran into that same politician again recently at South by Southwest. Um, do you remember? Do you
no,
remember that
yeah,
one?
it's. I mean, it's kind of a complicated story, but I've only
Okay.
photographed Howard Dean once, and the only reason I photographed him was, uh, so I was in Iowa, it was in Des Moines, and Joan Jett was going to do a concert before Howard Dean spoke, and so I wanted to see Joan Jett, and so I get on Dean's press van. There were only like 8 or 9 people following him at that point. This is on a Saturday. It's 3 days before the caucus in Iowa. And so Joan Jett's doing this little concert. Howard Dean's going to show up. I kind of had to photograph him anyways, but I hadn't photographed him. And at this point, I kind of know politics, and I know uh, you can get a sense in a campaign like immediately where this campaign is going. And as a photographer, at least, I don't think the pundits get it. Maybe they don't realize it. Maybe they just need to have something to talk about on the cable shows. I don't know, something to write essays about to keep people interested. But you can see pretty quick who has the chops to be a national candidate and who doesn't. And so after this event, I knew that Howard Dean was leaving the polls. He was, cover of Time Magazine, all that kind of stuff. He was the bright-eyed child of of the presidential race. And after this event, I knew he was toast. And sure enough, 3 days later, he had his meltdown on stage after like coming in third in Iowa or something, and he had his Yahoo moment where he like just sounds kind of off, and it just killed his campaign immediately. But the story is, I we're in the van, and like I said, I just jumped on the van to see Joan Jett. I didn't, I had to make some pictures of Howard Dean, but really the attraction was, uh, and so when you're in Iowa, in Des Moines, you might have 3 or 4 candidates in Des Moines on a Saturday afternoon. So you got plenty to do. So I had shot somebody else. I think I had done Hillary in the morning. I don't remember. It's all, whatever. But so I got on his van in the afternoon, and we pull into a parking lot. And there's an older volunteer with a Howard Dean for President t-shirt on, and he's manning the parking lot. And so we're sitting in the van, and the guy, he stopped the van to talk to the driver, and he had a seizure. I mean, he collapsed against the van, and you could tell he was having an episode. And I said, and so that's the other thing, most people, when they're in these situations, they kind of freeze. And photojournalists, not to say anything about myself, but most photojournalists they don't freeze. They're kind of used to that. They don't get tunnel vision. They keep their wits about them. And so we were way in the back, me and another photographer, and we were like, let us out, because we're going to help the guy. And so one of us called 911, the other one got this guy on his side, so he wouldn't throw up or swallow his tongue or anything like this. So we're helping the guy out. And so then somebody else showed up, and they're like, get out of here, get out. We're like, what? That's weird. We're getting kicked out of the, and I'm just fine, we're vultures or something. We're helping the guy. I'm like, that's weird. I'm like, fine, I don't have any reason to stay here. There's other people, there's ambulances on the way, that kind of stuff. And so we walk to the other side of the street, and the other photographer starts shooting pictures from across the street. I'm like, what are you shooting pictures of? He's like, that's Howard Dean. And so I didn't notice that the guy who came over to help, and the reason we were kicked out of the area when we were trying to help this guy, was because Howard Dean had showed up, and Howard Dean is a doctor. And so this guy was having a real issue, and he was having a seizure, and Dean was there, and there was, the Howard Dean t-shirt, and the guy was foaming at the mouth, literally. And it wasn't that's not a picture that I'm necessarily going to make. I'm not going to make a picture of a guy just foaming at the mouth, just make a picture of a guy foaming at the mouth. There has to be, some type of reason. And so I'm like, hold it. I look over there, and I see that it's Howard Dean, the doctor, helping this guy. So now I'm like, they kicked us out because they didn't want us photographing the doctor helping a guy, and they kicked us out off a public sidewalk, and they're trying to keep us away from the situation. So that, my job is to make pictures of the candidate, especially since, this is what he actually does as a doctor. And so I went back over there, and I started taking pictures, right. And I was taking pictures from the guy's feet. So I was shooting Howard Dean. I wasn't shooting the guy's face, foaming at the mouth with the Howard Dean t-shirt. I wasn't taking that, low blow. But I am photographing the Howard Dean, the candidate / doctor, helping this guy. And that's my job. I wasn't interfering with anything. Immediately, these campaign guys, started grabbing me. And Howard Dean himself gets up from helping the guy, and he's got his hand in a fist, and he's coming over to punch me. And I'm still making pictures of this scene. And I'm like, this is a guy who will never be president. Just right then, it's just and sure enough, 3 days later, he was out. But that's, that those pictures have never been published. But that's the story.
Yeah, so there was actually something real happening that the campaign couldn't control, and they wanted to still try and control it. But of course, nobody's stopping Ken Jarecki, the PFJ, right? I mean, so, and I remember you're telling me, did you run into Howard Dean at South by Southwest or something, and he made some,
No,
he remembered?
no. I ran into the driver of the van at South by Southwest,
Yeah.
and he is the creator of what's the show with
Is it
it's
Vice or something, or?
no, it's the political show with Kevin Spacey.
Oh, House of
Really,
Cards.
House of Cards. Really,
Yeah.
really. I mean, the first I only watched the first two seasons, and it was really good. Really loved that show.
Yeah.
He's the creator behind that show, and I didn't
Okay.
know that. And I was speaking at South by Southwest, and he was a speaker, and I just wanted to, I was interested in the show, so I went and heard him speak, and his insights into the political process um, were spot on, and you don't get that from being outside of the bubble, as they say. So afterwards I saw him in a bar, and I'm like, I got to tell you, you really you really know your way inside the campaign and the political process. He's like, yeah, I used to be a driver for Howard Dean. And I'm like, what are the odds, right? So I said, I only went out with Dean once, and this is what happened. He's like, yeah, I was driving the van that day. You're a real asshole. And I'm like, no, you're an asshole. And so that was the end of that budding relationship. So, whoever the
That's
creator
awesome.
is of House of Cards, go fuck yourself. That's
That's
my
hilarious.
message to you today.
He'll remain nameless. We don't know his. He's not important enough to know his name, but I just think that that story was so fascinating because I mean, I've been in a situation before where I felt this sort of animosity of people around me, for me wanting to do what I consider to be my job, and I mean, it happens in street photography all the time. I get chewed out on the street anytime I'm doing street photography, and I'm like, people are basically criticizing you, cursing you out, calling you an asshole, just for doing your job.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of get used to it. It's like they it's weird that how people always assume the worst, and then um they always assume that you're either an ultra conservative or an ultra liberal. There's no medium ground. It's um whatever their golden calf is, you must be on the opposite side of that. That's, and I don't know why they it's common. I mean, as you're working as a photojournalist, like you're out to get somebody. I don't know any photographer who's out to get anybody. I saw
Hmm.
a tweet today. Somebody's talking about, and this is like a sponsored story that World Press Photo put out about, does photography really matter? Does the activist photographer really change anything? And no photojournalist I've ever known has ever referred to themselves as an activist. Uh, and most of them are at least wise enough to know that they're or humble enough to know that um, they're not going to uh, necessarily make anything better. As a photojournalist, your job is just to show what's happening there as an honest and as engaging way as you can. You got to engage people to get them to see, right? You got to get them to look at what you're trying to show them. It could be any, Minamata. We use Minamata as an example. Um, the factory is pumping mercury into the harbor, and the fishermen are feeding their families fish caught from the harbor, and people are having babies that are born with severe disabilities, and it's killing the whole community, this factory pumping mercury into the water that everybody uses. Okay, if those pictures aren't good and if they're not engaging, nobody ever gets to the point where, oh, these people are being killed by this mercury and this is the situation. So, you know, it's not about, I mean, it's not about changing the world or being an activist for an activist uh, case. It's just about showing people so that they can actually have those discussions. Like you use the term democracy. Um, we can't have a democracy if we're not all talking about the same thing, or at least have a basic knowledge about what the issues are. And that's when how photojournalism, that's how a free press comes into play. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's not that we're trying to be activists. We might have a very, strong opinions about how it's bad to be, feed people mercury poison fish. That's bad. But our point is to bring it into the public square to discuss it and change it if and find out what the solution is. That's what
Yeah.
we do as photojournalists, as journalists.
Exactly. I mean, it's just show reality, and it's just so interesting that in the case of politics, that they want to try to create their own reality as opposed to letting reality play itself out in real life. I mean, you mentioned to me in the context talking about street photography and even just talking about as little of things as like posing people in an editorial fashion shoot, that that reality will give you something that's way better than you could have ever imagined. That you couldn't have staged this seizure next to the bus with Howard Dean the doctor being there rushing to his rescue. I mean, if it was an episode of Mad Men or whatever, it would be like a huge climatic moment or dramatic moment. And you could have never have written that in advance. I mean, they could try to stage pictures of him with the doctor, with the stethoscope, with the white coat, but it's never going to be as good as him running off the bus and helping a guy on the side of a bus with the seizure, you know? And so
Well,
it's so interesting how that would backfire in their case. Their need to control the situation actually, led them to missing out on probably some of the best pictures that painted him in some of the best light that you could have never even imagined if you tried to write it.
and that's why it was so evident that his campaign was dead from that. He didn't know who he was. He's in charge of his own campaign. He's in charge of his own message, and if he doesn't know who he is, how is he going to get that message? How's he going to give his campaign staff the proper frame of mind, the proper marching orders to capture that? No, they're just, the press is the enemy. This is the new campaign. Remember, this was the first campaign completely financed through donations over the internet. Um,
Mm-hmm.
they thought they were going to do it, bypass the, which is now pretty much a reality. The mainstream media is kind of through their own fault, they're kind of out of the conversation. They've let themselves be branded, and they've stepped right into the noose, and they've hung themselves. That's where we're at now with the mainstream media. Half the people will believe them, half the people will swear they're lying, and if the situation is reversed, the people that believe them and the people that don't will be reversed as well. I mean, it's just, that's where they're at. That's what they're when I worked for Time Magazine, it was a place where, you could disagree with Time Magazine, you could be upset with Time Magazine, but it's at a place where everybody went to have a discussion. And not all the time, but a lot of the time, Time Magazine would start that discussion. And they were in such a position that, and Newsweek was too, that if they started a discussion, there's a good reason, there's merit to having this discussion. Well, they don't have that anymore. None of them do. The New York Times, Washington Post, the magazines that are left, none of them have that. universal stamp of not authority, but just like, you know,
Being
well,
above politics.
being above the fray,
Yeah.
being um,
Having
being
integrity.
integrity. Yeah, just a stamp of integrity that, you can disagree with them, but since they're talking about it, it's pretty important. And then, you think, okay, well, what about YouTube? What about Twitter? What about Instagram? What people don't realize is that when you had a picture on the cover of Time magazine in the 80s or the 90s, that was whatever they had at the time. So they had 8 million subscribers. Maybe it was 4, I don't know what it was exactly. It didn't matter because every issue they printed was seen by 4 or 5 different people. On top of that, it was in every doctor's office, every dentist's office, and it was on the end cap of uh, every checkout line in every grocery store. So if the population was 350 million people in the United States at that time, not even the rest of the world, um, everybody, say there's half of that, say there's 175 million adults at that time. 95% of those people saw the cover of Time magazine that week. We're not talking about a million or 10 million followers on Instagram who just kind of glance at,
Yeah.
a Kardashian picture on Instagram. Time magazine was a big deal. It started conversations. It got people talking about the same thing regardless of where they were in politics. That doesn't exist, and it's really hard to keep the ball rolling when you've got whatever, uh, this cable channel on this side and these other channels on this side, and none of them none of them add up to 150 million adults at least paging through Time magazine or reading the cover of Time magazine as they're checking out from getting groceries. There's nothing like that.
Yeah. For sure. And so now we start to have, the media outlets are more so just taking what they can get. They're being spoon fed by these political campaigns. Like the narrative, they go along with whatever narrative they're trying to sell.
They don't have people in
Um,
position that even recognize there is a narrative. Remember, they're getting they don't have photographers that have 5 years of, by and large, I mean, certainly Reuters and AP, they have experienced great photographers. Getty has great political photographers, but by and large, they don't have the editorial staff uh, of a guy who's a gal, a person who's 50 years old and has already seen everything and fallen for some of the tricks, but they know, you know, where the bodies are buried. They know not to get fooled in this manner. They don't have that mature uh, institutional knowledge, keepers of, the flame. Those people have been gotten rid of.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, okay. So going on with the Howard Dean story, I think it illustrates another issue. And shoot, sorry, I got totally distracted there. I was thinking about this. Oh, so the other issue with the Dean story is this idea of like pissing off the gatekeepers. So you, in this particular case, I mean, you kind of set it up as you had a pretty good idea that he wasn't going to make it. But if we had changed this scenario, and let's say that's George Bush Jr., and it's, would you behave differently because you wouldn't want to piss him off because you think this guy's got a chance, he's going to be a national campaign, I'm going to have to put up with these people, I'm going to have to be on this bus for another 6 months, I'm going to have to be on Air Force One eventually with these same people, and if I want to be in the room, I better not go get in his face while he's when they're telling me not to.
No, I mean you play your cards as well as you can, and I've not been really good at, uh, as George Bush Jr. would say, strategery. I'm not. I don't. I don't.
You're not a great poker player.
Well, I kind of just. I pissed them all off. I pissed off people that I'm became great friends with. I mean, it's just I don't, and I still get access. And you know, the first day of the campaign, I remember, and this is not uncommon for me. I mean, when I talk about an editor having to like go to bat for me, that happened all the time because I was always pissing people off. It's just my nature.
Mm.
And so, the first day of the Bob Dole campaign, I was on for like the last month of his campaign. And the first day I was there, the they tried to, Time Magazine had an embedded photographer who was, had a campaign staff pin, which meant he could go anywhere and kind of do whatever he wanted. And so he was shooting black and white. So Time Magazine just put me there to shoot color in case they needed some color photography. So they actually had two people on the campaign. And the first day on the campaign, I went into the buffer zone, which is kind of where the photographers, there's risers, there's cutaways, which are also usually risers, and there's usually like a secondary position behind, the stage or opposite the cutaway, whatever. The cutaways to the side, the main platform is straight on. I mean, that's just how basic campaign uh, events are set up as far as TV. That's basically for TV. And the still photographers kind of roam between those positions. There's also the buffer, which is the buffer zone between the stage where the candidate is and where the crowd starts. And so there's like might be 12 or 15 feet gap there between the crowd and the candidate. That's called the buffer zone. And that's where the Secret Service works. That's where campaign staffers work. And it's also where the still photographers and usually one pool TV camera is in the buffer zone. The photographers usually, with most campaigns, have the run of the place. That's kind of changed in recent years. First it changed with Hillary, where they really tried to wrangle photographers and keep them on either the main platform or the cutaway and let them rotate into the buffer zone. And then it changed even further with the Trump campaign, who almost eliminated the buffer zone and only had the main platform for photographers to work from. You know, that's how, I mean, as a photographer, as a still photographer, when you're trying to make sense of a political campaign, just being limited to the TV shot, which is going to look very good on cable television, but has no meaning for your magazine or your newspaper to shoot a picture from the back riser, every day, 5 times a day from 10 different campaign events. I mean, it's meaningless as a still photographer. So that's why the still photographers kind of roam usually. Well, so the first day, get back to the story. The first day, I moseyed into the buffer zone, and the photographer wrangler pulled me out of the buffer zone. She said, "You guys already have a photographer here." I'm like, "Well, that guy's shooting black and white. I'm shooting color." And she's like, "Nope, you got to be back on the main riser." I'm like, "No, I'm not going to be on the main riser, and this will be my last day on the campaign." I went back to the bus, and it got heated. I mean, there were, F-bombs going back and forth between me and her, and um, that's just the nature of it's part of my workflow. And so, uh,
F bombs are integral to the workflow.
yeah. So, anyways, I was out of there. I wasn't gonna, day rate be damned. I'm not gonna sit on the back riser for the next 30 days. I don't even bring a 300. I didn't even have a long piece of glass. Why would I sit back there? So, yeah, I mean, it got ugly, and eventually, the campaign relented, but that was, my first introduction to the person who was in charge of wrangling the photographers for the Dole campaign. Within 2 or 3 days, we were bosom buddies, and I mean, and those, you have those relationships on a campaign. There's people that you click with, and people that you don't, and it doesn't have anything to do with Republican or Democrat or anything like that. It's just how just personal relationships. We became great friends. We were great friends today. I'm sure her phone number is somewhere on, or her email is on my cell phone or something. I mean, it's just, and that happens to me all the time. Sometimes I always get off on the wrong foot with people. It doesn't ever, it's always worked for me. So I'm not.
Well, one thing, I mean, you kind of mentioned it sometimes. We've talked before when we talk about street photography, you talk about claiming your space. It's in your book, your chapter on street photography. Making your presence known, making your intentions aware, making other people aware of your intentions. And you're definitely that kind of person. It's sort of like brutal honesty. Like, I'm here to be a PFJ, and I'm not going to stand on the back of the riser. And if you don't like it, then it's my last day here, and you can just not get these pictures in Time Magazine. I don't care. But if you let me in, you let me make my pictures and do my thing, you'll probably find out I'm actually a pretty decent, nice guy, and we'll get along.
Yeah, I mean, so what I usually say is, with political, if I'm talking to a politician, for having a candid conversation, I would just tell them, I've told them before, half my pictures you're going to hate, half of them you'll really like. It's just, and I don't have any say on what the magazine chooses to publish. So there you have it. But
Yeah.
you want to. I've been cussed out by more than one would-be president. I mean, some of them became president, but it wasn't like either one of us held that against the other, and
Hmm.
I still got onto the second floor of wherever I needed to be, and uh, it just I don't know, just being an honest, real person, especially in the world of politics where everybody's phony. I
Yeah,
mean, maybe that's
exactly.
just refreshing. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. It is a refreshing honesty that you have. This is a perfect segue into a skill that Karen mentioned that we've talked about before, but it's this ability to relate to people, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, whether they're Huskers or Hawkeyes. It's kind of a basic social skill, that's lacking these days, like the ability to have a conversation with someone that doesn't 100% agree with you on every single subject, especially in the area of politics where everyone talks about how we have like tribal politics these days. But talk about that. I mean, Karen mentioned it before, is like being able to relate to the everyday person, being able to relate to someone no matter what walk of life they may be from. You're in boardrooms, you're on the streets, everyone in between. As a PFJ, you have to be able to you know communicate, relate, schmooze your way in, have social skills, all of those kind of things. So I mean, I think in this case, I mean, just talk about the importance of that, the ability to, like, those basic social skills.
So what? So it basically, it's a direct reflection on your ability to communicate, whether it's with pictures or words. And I'm not really good with words. I'm not really good with, just I'm not a I'm not good at small talk and just like hanging out and being like, you know, I just want to be there. Uh, just ignore me. I'm happy, whatever. But
Well, the thing is, you actually are good at it. You just don't like to do it.
yeah, it's just I I I I like to keep, um, just like to keep a low profile. But so the thing is, why how you communicate when you're talking to a person is the same way you make pictures of a person. And so, if I can't Okay, so you have the National Geographic approach, right? The National Geographic approach is the whole world is defined by the hats they wear. You know, you go to Iran and you got the bread head. You go to Montana, you got the cowboy hat. That's the National Geographic approach. It's like get the person in the funny hat, and that's how we relate to them. Well, for me, photography is not about the kind of hat you wear. It's about universal truths. It's about universal things that everybody has in common. And if you get past that, if you get past those surface issues of the type of funny hat that every different culture has, then you're talking about real things. And now to do that with photography, which is a completely surface based medium, is very hard to do, but that's what you're doing as a photographer, as a photojournalist. You're getting beyond those surface things, even though that's what you're photographing is the surface. So if I can't do that with words, if I can't talk to a person with words in the same way that I want to photograph them in an honest, straightforward way that we can both relate to, and they know that, they just get that right away. I don't know what I'd say to get them to get that, but that attitude is going to be reflected in the images I make. And so it happens all the time, and it freaks me out. It's like I did a couple years where I was working for People magazine a lot, and I was doing the Life magazine style stories that People used to do at that point. The heroes, the extraordinary personalities, whatever, where you get into their life, and people would just like invite me into their homes, and I'd be there for 5 days, and I'd have to like sneak out at night, just to go back to my hotel room. And they would leave me with their kids. They would, they'd go into the bedroom and take a nap, and I'd be like sitting with their kids for 3 hours watching Sesame Street, whatever it was. And I'm just like, I've been here less than a day, and how does that happen? I don't really know how that happens. I just know it happens a lot.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, Elvis's housekeepers making you sandwiches, and you're going shopping with Sean Johnson and all these sort of things. So you're talking about in the interpersonal skills uh, of the ability to relate to the subject when you're photographing a subject. But I also think that it comes in really handy in these situations, especially in politics, where you have that velvet rope sort of dilemma that's always there of like, how do I get past the velvet rope? How do I do it without pissing people off? Who can I schmooze to get myself into that room? Or how can I mend this relationship with someone that I might have pissed off? That's all social skills.
Yeah, I'm not a great schmoozer, but when people get me, it's like I got all access. I got the all access pass. I don't know how that happens. And even
Yeah.
like I can tell you, um, this happened with politics all the time. I'd walk backstage, and some poor a local handler, someone who might even be a volunteer, would be like, "Sir, you can't be back here." I'd go, "Yeah, I can." And and then if they were any good, the advanced person who was working Iowa events would move on to New Hampshire and South Carolina, and pretty soon it'd be a national campaign. And that
Yeah.
person who, I just like said, I'm going to be here. There's nothing you can do about it. If you don't like it, I'll go someplace else, whatever, call a cop. Um, those people, a lot of them would go on to national campaigns. And we'd always, you know, at that point, after you've broken the ice at that point, and you have a national campaign, and now you have Secret Service involved, and now there's actually some real rules, and you're not at like the local VFW, all of a sudden that 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 gravitas you kind of established back in Iowa, that plays forward.
Yeah.
But it's not about schmoozing. So it's just about like,
It's not schmoozing, but it's
I
like
don't know.
just the ability to communicate and not look at this person with disdain, like because you're a Republican or you're a Democrat or you wear a particular type of hat. It's that you kind of exude that sort of personality.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how it happens.
But that's definitely a skill I think that comes in handy for photojournalists trying to get in and out of places. And like you mentioned, like, you know, you're going to end up having maybe a year-long relationship with this person. I think if you make your intentions known up front and you're not trying to do something sneaky, you're not sneaking around trying to hide and, you know, things like this, you just own the space, make your intentions clear, and eventually they'll get on board, assuming that you're not legitimately a huge asshole, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a real person, but you're a real person that, you know, it's like, I don't know, I'm here to fix your sink, you know, have a, you know, the plumber. Just, you know, I'm gonna have to take everything out of your sink underneath the cabinet to get to your sink. I'm gonna make a mess, but in the end, it's gonna, you know, your sink's gonna work perfectly. I don't know if that's a great analogy, but it's like I'm 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 here, you know, I'm here to you know serve the kielbasa, but making kielbasa is not necessarily a fun process to watch.
Exactly. Okay, so I got two more questions on politics stuff. The first one is a technical one. Just want you to talk about lens choices when you're shooting political campaigns. Shoot, and then also you can mention talking about just shooting politics, like in DC.
The first campaign I shot almost exclusively with a 20. I was shooting a lot with the 20. I was using a lot of strobe blur. This was just because everybody else was shooting tungsten film and it didn't look good, or they were shooting direct flash and it looked equally bad. And so I just wanted something where I could blend daylight and flash and tungsten and fluorescent light all together. And I wanted to do something sloppy and messy. And that's where the 20 millimeter lens came in. And, you know,
What would you say would be a how do you make use of a 20 millimeter? That's pretty wide.
I'm looking for a book on my, so I didn't know it. Like I said, I wasn't sophisticated enough at the time, but basically I was ripping off the things that William Klein did, you know, 20 years before me, you know, with strobe blur and wide angles and just getting up in people's grills and that kind of thing.
Exactly. All right. So as you developed as a political photographer, I mean, if you're going to go shoot a camp, if let's say you're going to go to Iowa, you know, what kind of thing are you going to be taking into like a campaign rally?
Well, like today, I'd probably shoot with like, you know, the thing is, I forget who said it. Anything you can shoot with a 20, you can shoot with a 24. And anything you can shoot with a 24, you can shoot better with a 28. So like maybe a 28 is the sweet spot if you're going to be in there doing stuff with strobes and blurring and having fun and stuff like that. Uh, you know, I let me let me look for
So you might
something.
you might use a 28. I mean, you're kind of known for using long lenses. Would you carry around a long lens on a campaign trail?
I did, you know, that first I'd go, you know, I'd shoot between a 20 and a 400 2.8, and then just the 400 2.8 became just slowed me down. So I probably shot a lot of my when I got on the, you know, carrying a 400 2.8 on a charter plane or a bus and trying to put it up above, you know, it just gets in the way. It, you know, so I probably shot, some with, probably have two cameras right now. I'd probably shoot with like a 28 and a 50 today. And then I'd have a third camera where I'd probably shoot with like a 135, something like that, if it was today.
Okay. And that you would not use a 400 mostly for the fact that you wouldn't want to carry it around. It would slow you down.
Well, there's not a whole lot to do with it. You know, if you're photographing the president and you're stuck on the back riser, um, I'm just not interested in shooting with a 400. I mean, it doesn't interest me. I want to shoot something that can, you know, juxtapose a couple people against one another. I mean, shooting with a 400 from a fixed location, you're not in the pop zone. You're not like bringing anything to that view that um, is interesting or adds anything to the situation. So yeah, I probably wouldn't shoot with a 400. I don't think you need one um, with this president because he does so many impromptu avails that, you know, you're shooting out on the rose garden. You don't need a 400 for that. You know, you need your 135 will come in handy, but I think you got enough availability with this president that you wouldn't have to do that.
Gotcha. All right, cool. And last question on this sort of topic, this whole idea about like how hard it is to shoot in your own backyard. And this is a topic that you and I have discussed a lot. I think actually one of the first times that I met you, you invited me to go to this talk at Laurel High School that you were giving, and you were trying to stress to these kids that, hey, people around the world, they want to see pictures of the things that you have right around you here in Montana. You know, they want to see pictures of cowboy hats and rodeos and rolling hills and mountains and all this kind of stuff that you take for granted, that you think is just boring, or even oil refinery, the culture of Montana in general. And so I just wanted to hear you, you know, reiterate that point a little bit about how it's a skill, it's a special kind of skill to be able to shoot in your own backyard, but it's one that I think most people need to try to practice.
Yeah, I just wanted to I'm going to share my screen here and see how this works.
It worked out great last time.
Well, we'll see if it works. This is can you see that?
Yeah, I can see it.
So this is
Carrie.
this is kind of what this is the stuff of Carrie. This was shot with like a Panasonic with a short zoom on it, but you can see what I'm trying to do with the strobe and stuff here. Uh, same camera. This with Carrie and Edwards, and you can see. So this is what happens in every like political campaign. You have this is after Kerry spoke at the convention, and it's like midnight. He's tired, and you have this guy here who he's probably worked on 50 different president. You know, I see him. I forget who he's working with this year, this campaign, but he's a known quantity. So, and this is so he's he's doing he's working for Edwards, and this guy over here is working for Kerry, and they're actually negotiating how they're going to go off onto the stage. And so it's behind the scenes, but it's you can see it's with a weird strobe. It's pretty tight. It's probably like a 28. And so this is all kind of 28 stuff. This is with like a 35 with Hillary. I'm not supposed to be there, but I'll just go through these and kind of give you an idea.
Yeah, yeah.
So this thing with this shot with Hillary is I'm not supposed to be there. You know, everything's very controlled, but this is like a public square. It's in Iowa and it's early in the campaign. You can see the guy in the Suburban in the back. You can see the guys over her right shoulder and the blue shirt on the left. She's already got Secret Service so it's very controlled, but I talked my way into this position with this splash of light that's kind of different, just so I could make a picture of her walking from the controlled event to her waiting car. And the guy who let me into that situation actually got in trouble for letting me into that situation. Here's another picture. Edwards, it's kind of a detail shot, but it's just, the sweat, it's 105 degrees there at the Iowa State Fair. So once again, it's a 28. You can see I'm strobing it in the daylight. And there's that little hint there with the campaign material stuff in his hand, just to give you a sense that it's actually Edwards. This is the backstage. There are only so many press people can get into a debate. And so if you're not one of those few people in the debate, you're in this big holding area, which has the debate on the screen. And so that's like an opportunity to make pictures. It's nothing pictures, but when you go back to your question of, the Laurel High School students, I could be just, sitting back there eating turkey sandwiches and waiting for, the debate to be over, or trying to rotate in and shoot. But there's pictures to be made there that most people never get to see, these type of situations. Or this is, just the juxtaposition between, Ron Paul, Hillary, and then you got like this, specter of Reagan in the background. And everybody plays in this picture, and
Yeah.
you got these lines, they're all pointing, all the lines are pointing up here to Reagan. This is the Bob Dole. This is actually a picture I really like. And it's just this, he's in a gym, and they pulled the limo into the gym. So, he doesn't, it's a security thing. It doesn't have to do with him not wanting to walk or anything, but it's just a security thing, to load the candidate, the protectee, into a safe environment before, he gets out in the public area. But this little like idea that you got this whole like TV set that's now hinted at in the background, and the balloons, the random balloons, and just the normal guy sitting in the car kind of looking out.
It's really nice light, and you use the strobe on that as well.
So you can see that it's so this is with a 20, this shot of Jesse, and this is a good example. This is like I had flown with Jesse on a Learjet. It was like 6 or 7 of us on a Learjet from Iowa to his hometown in Greenville. And this is for the New York Times magazine. So I was like the only photographer. We got into Greenville about 3 a.m. He insisted on going to his mother's house for dinner. And so we ate dinner, full Southern meal at 3 a.m. And then we got up at 6 a.m. to do this event, which was a local museum was dedicating a room or a statue to him or something. I don't remember what. But I was so tired that I was just it was so crowded and so hot. I was sitting out on the porch, and then I heard Jesse starting to cry. And so I, pushed my way into the front of the crowd, and I didn't know there was like this mini Jesse statue and stuff on the wall. Otherwise I would have been working it from the start.
Yeah.
So this is after a debate. It's a small debate. It's early in the campaign, but you got Gary Hart, you got Al Gore, you got Dukakis, you got Jesse. And this might be shot with a 20, might be shot with a 28. I'm thinking of 28, but this idea.
Wow, I really like that.
Yeah. So you got this strobe coming in way from the left, I've got this strobe way out here. I'm shooting like this. And just to create this composition that kind of shows these 4 key players out of, the 7 who were still around at that point. And this is kind of on purpose. This was the zoo plane. So you got this is like 2 weeks before the general election, and the zoo plane, which is the secondary press plane. You got the main campaign plane, then you got the zoo plane, which is like secondary for the overflow that can't fit in the main plane. which is where I never wanted to be on the main plane. You know, you miss some stuff by not being on the main plane, but I'd just rather be on the relaxing zoo plane where you can just kind of relax and let your guard down and don't have to always be, you know, minding your P's and Q's and all that kind of stuff. But anyways, so the main campaign plane had broken down, and we had this one event somewhere in Louisiana, and everybody had to cram onto the zoo plane. It was just, you know, it was ridiculous. There weren't even enough seats for everybody, but you could kind of get away with that stuff in that time for like a 20-minute plane ride.
Yeah.
And so this was just, you know, they had tungsten light on him. And so I shot it with tungsten film, even though it was out in the daylight, just to make it whatever.
Nice.
This is in Atlanta. This is like when I first started, like figuring out the kind of the absurdity of our political, how we elect, you know, and I love it. I'm not complaining, but it is crazy. And so I think this is at like Pat Robertson event.
That's awesome.
This is just, you know, I think the political photos are always made from, you know, they're usually like at the beginning or the end, not in the middle when the actual event that you're supposed to be photographing is happening. So this is just, you know, just kind of a nice little shot. And that guy, that reporter, actually died in Iraq.
Ooh.
So this is at the Texas Capitol, and when we were doing the voter count thing, that you know, the 2000 election that never ended. And this is Kucinich's guys. Kucinich is the best, and you know his people are the best. And it's a every time, you know, Dennis Kucinich is like the nicest guy in the world, and he always brings a
Yeah.
smile to my face just to hang out with the guy. And he's just, you know, and his supporters are just having as much fun as he is. I just, you know, and he's a serious politician, but he does, and he's got national appeal, never be elected to a national office, but he's a smart guy and I like him. And so,
Yeah.
and this is with uh, Bush Senior, and that's just kind of one of those things where, you know, you have the light. This is probably with the 20. You're right up in there, and he's vice president. He's running for president at the time. This is actually in Omaha. That's the leader of Boys Town over his left shoulder, the priest. And so this idea that you can use this strobe and also you can almost make it look like a cardboard cutout, like that Ronald Reagan in an earlier frame. It
Yeah.
kind of just looks like a cardboard cutout of George Bush, and I kind of like that ability to do that. So that's just some stuff that Vanity Fair ran over. Um, and this is okay. So this picture of Kerry is important just because uh, he borrowed a guitar impromptu. Everybody else had already gone to file, and so all the wire photographers were filing their images. And Kerry's still out there because they're on a major deadline. You know, they got to get their images. So, and the newspaper guys are on the same deadline. So, I had Kerry to myself here for probably 7 or 8 minutes while he's just playing his guitar,
Wow.
a borrowed guitar with this band, you know, and it's just another kind of absurd type of political moment.
You kind of hit on some really good points in there that you've told me so many times, and that are it's in your. I think there's a chapter maybe on sports photography on your ebook, you know, where you talk about like you don't just take out your camera when Kerry or when you know when the debate timer starts and the debate starts. You know, you're taking pictures even if you're in the overflow room, even if you're in that back room, the side room with the projectors and all that stuff. You're not just so you mentioned before that you know you're shooting the whole time, whether you're en route to the event, you're at the event. It's not just like in a football game. It's not just sort of like, okay, when the players hit the field and the whistle blows, then I start becoming a photographer. Like there's so many pictures that you're going to miss if that's what you're doing.
Yeah, everything plays. And that's what, you know, if you're Stephen Crowley, everything plays. He's always shooting. He's shooting from when he wakes up in the morning until when he goes to bed that night, when he's on the campaign. He's always shooting. Everything comes into the play. Same with David Burnett. And so if you look at Crowley, Crowley's like the newspaper guy who was, it in Washington, D.C. Burnett was very important as he brought kind of this color realm into political photography that didn't really exist before, and made beautiful color images under lights that weren't really designed to pull that kind of stuff off. So but both of those guys, what they do is they're always shooting. Everything comes into play. It might not end up being part of their so-called political coverage, but it's part of their vision. It's part of what they're seeing.
Yeah. And, we've talked a little bit about how partially in the film days, you kind of had no choice but to continue to work and work and work, because you couldn't be like, hey, I got the shot that I need for Reuters or The Wire or whatever, so I'm just going to go run with it. You had to keep going and keep working. And also that Carrie picture reminds me of another thing that, when everyone else leaves, because if they're a newspaper photographer or wire photographer, they have a particular deadline. You don't have, that doesn't mean you have to leave. You don't have if you're a magazine photographer, you don't have that deadline. So I would almost think that would be almost like when that's like game time for you, because that's when you're going to make pictures where no one else is going to have those pictures.
Well, when the first State of the Union I shot, and once again, I'm not sure how much of this was training, how much of it was instinct or just learned adaptive behavior. But the first State of the Union I shot was like in 87, 88, something like that. It was with Ronald Reagan. And it was a long day. And you get out of there, you get out of the Capitol, and I don't know if they still do this. I don't know if they have lights built in now, but the TV, the networks used to bring in lights to light the outside of the Capitol building. And so I'd never seen that before. Maybe they, I was my first, I don't know, could have been doing it since the 50s. I don't know. But it was intriguing to me that you had these big, huge temporary lights set up to photograph the Capitol. And so I was just working these lights. And a couple other photographers came by and they're like, Ken, we're going to go get a beer. And I'm like, yeah, I'll catch up with you. I just want to shoot this picture. I want to work this picture. And they're like, yeah, whatever. We're tired. We're going to have some beer. And I just wanted, to go and join them. And it was just, very tempting. But I really just wanted to make this picture, this situation that was unique, at least to me. And so nothing ever came of that picture. It was never published. I wasn't on assignment to shoot the State of the Union. But, like 6 months later, I think it was Bobby Baker Burroughs. She was like, oh, I so wanted to use that picture. We had it on our contents page, a double page spread of the lights on the Capitol. That was so beautiful, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, so I never got any ink. I never got any money, but maybe that helped me out in ways that I didn't know.
Exactly.
And so that was, half the time you'd never even hear about that. Just happened to hear about it.
Yeah, exactly. All right, man. Well, that pretty much wraps up all the questions that I have.
Okay, you got a book that you want to talk about? Well, you've got the book recommendation for this episode.
All right, sweet. Yeah, I happen to have this little book with me. I'll kind of give the cheap books. You got the expensive books, but this book is called David Bailey Exposed. David Bailey is like a fashion and celebrity photographer from the 60s. And this book, David Bailey Exposed, is called Bailey Exposed. It's on the back. It says it's only €10, but somehow I paid $20 for it, according to the tag on the front. But I wanted to read a quote out of it because basically what the book has a bunch of pictures, and then it has these big quotes from David Bailey throughout. And one of them was kind of relevant to this concept that we were talking about like shooting pictures in your own backyard and trying to stay motivated. And he just said, the pictures don't get better the longer you're around the subject. The moment's the moment, and you don't want them to be bored with you either, because the magic goes. You have to get to the magic quick. If I go to Delhi, I get off the plane and I start photographing, because 5 days later, it all starts to look normal. And I've experienced that when I've actually been to India before. But it kind of gets back to that idea that we were talking about, that if you live in a place like Montana, you've been there for obviously more than 5 days, it all starts to look normal. It all starts to look boring, and you find yourself uninspired to photograph it. But like you and Alex mentioned, that when you go to a war zone, it's interesting, because 99% of people never are been in a war zone, but tons of people have been to Iowa. They've been in, the VFW, their local VFW or whatever. So it's not as interesting. So you really have to work and practice to be able to make those, shoot in your own backyard or make a normal, boring place. You got to keep coming back at it. Like I think Karen Malarkey said, like a child, you have to look at it from a different perspective. You have to be constantly curious. So anyway, that's the book suggestion. It's a cheap one. You can probably find it used on Amazon for like $5.
That's a great suggestion. Thanks. And thanks for talking. Thank you all for watching. We'll do this again soon. Thanks, Paul.
Yep, no problem. Thanks.